Hi, my name's Tony Ward and I'm an Associate Professor of Counselling Psychology at the University of the West of England. I'm also a visiting lecturer at the University of Paris 8, where I work with a colleague, Arnaud Plagnion. And Arnaud and I have been working for some years on what we now call cognitive psychodynamic therapy. And this is the first of a sequence of short videos to explain the principles of cognitive psychodynamic therapy. And you'll notice that I've included the logo of the British Psychological Society on this first slide. And that's because we've recently had funding here at the University of the West of England to look at the efficacy of cognitive psychodynamic therapy from the British Psychological Society. So in this sequence of videos, we're going to start off with an overview of therapeutic approaches, and then in the next presentation we're going to go into more detail on the cognitive and neuroscience theory. And then in the third video we're going to start thinking about how we can apply cognitive psychodynamic principles to client issues. And we're going to be looking at the case, a case which Arnaud in fact worked with and has published on, of Monsieur K. And we'll go in the fourth video into more detail on the principles and that particular case. So these presentations are all based on a book which is due to come out in November 2019, Cognitive Psychodynamics as an Integrative Framework in Counselling, Psychology and Psychotherapy, written by myself and my colleague Arnaud. Arnaud in fact has spent quite a bit of time over the years thinking about how cognitive theories of representation can help us to understand the kinds of issues faced by our clients in psychotherapy, and wrote, for example, this text in French, Espace de représentation. So, thinking about different theories of counselling and psychotherapy, I'm assuming that many of the people listening to this video will be counselling psychologists or therapists in the United Kingdom. So if you are a counselling psychologist or you are a trainee counselling psychologist, the chances are that you've been exposed to one or probably two of these main models of psychotherapy: cognitive behaviour therapy, psychodynamic therapy, which is the two we do here at the University of the West of England, also existential therapy and person-centred therapy. For example, Glasgow Caledonian use person-centred as one of their core approaches. The problem with these different models of therapy, as many of you will realise, is that they often give slightly different explanations of the origins of client distress. And as a result of that, they may have different ideas and thoughts about how, as therapists, we should go about working with clients with particular issues. I often think that this is a bit like the parable of the elephant and the blindfolded counselling psychologist. So depending on which part of the elephant the blindfolded counselling psychologist feels and examines, they'll have a completely different view of what an elephant actually is. And it's only by taking the blindfold off and looking at the totality of the elephant that you would fully come to understand what it is that an elephant actually consists of. It's interesting for a moment just to look at the history of the development of these different therapeutic ideas. We know, of course, that this all started in around about 1900 with Sigmund Freud's ideas on talking therapy. Freud first published thoughts in 1895. By the early 1900s, psychoanalysis was rapidly becoming very popular. And one of the key people at that time who was interested in Freud's ideas and who worked with him was Otto Rank. However, Otto Rank diverged from Freud in the 1920s. And as a result, the two didn't really see eye to eye, and Otto Rank moved to the United States, where he was to be very influential on a number of key individuals. For example, we know that Otto Rank visited Carl Rogers at his child development clinic at Rochester in New York in the 1930s, and it's highly likely that Rogers would have got hold of and read some of Rank's books written at that time, such as on will therapy, for example. So another person who said that they were extremely influenced by Otto Rank was Rollo May, who is accredited generally with being one of the pioneers of the existential approach to therapy. Of course, in the 1940s, we had new ideas being developed about therapy from within psychology, which at that time was very behaviour focused. B.S. Skinner, for example, developed operant conditioning, and those principles came to be applied to anxiety and phobias very successfully. And then in the 1950s, we had Aaron Beck, who took up ideas from the newly emerging cognitive psychology and started to develop cognitive therapy. And these two strands of therapeutic work from within psychology, the behavioural and cognitive, came to be brought together in the 1970s into what we now know as cognitive behaviour therapy. So we can see within the last 100 years we've had the original psychodynamic ideas, which obviously focus quite a bit on the notion of unconscious processes. Otto Rank developed Freud's thinking but became much more interested and put more emphasis on the notion of relationship, and that then influenced humanistic therapists such as Rollo May and Carl Rogers. And then from within psychology we get this strong cognitive behavioural tradition. There have been attempts to try and bring all this back together in integrative therapy, but very few people so far have come up with a coherent strategy for bringing together the cognitive and psychodynamic strands from within therapy. One person who has is Marty Horowitz. And Marty wrote several texts in which he used the term cognitive psychodynamic. It's a book published in the 1990s, for example, called Cognitive Psychodynamic Therapy, which talks about how we can try and bring these two streams together. Arno Plagnol and I think that now is a great time for taking this forward further, because over the last 20 to 30 years there's been a huge increasing amount of work done in cognitive psychology and neuroscience, which we can now bring together to think about the issues that our clients face. And within cognitive psychology there are two big themes I would suggest. If you look through current leading texts, for example this one by Eysenck and Keene. So the two big themes are conscious awareness, encapsulated in models such as Alan Badley's working memory model, and how we store and process past experience, and how that past experience comes to influence our current behaviour. And it's worth noting quickly that there's a huge emphasis now in modern cognitive psychology on the implicit effect of our past experience, how things that have happened to us before can affect our current behaviour and thoughts without us actually being aware of it implicitly. So just to illustrate these two themes, first of all let's start off with a classic demonstration of conscious awareness. So what I want you to do is to try and remember the following digits, which I'm going to put on the screen. So try and keep these numbers in your mind. Okay, so keep trying to keep those numbers in your mind as I carry on talking. Obviously in this demonstration what I'm now trying to do is to distract you a little bit and make it harder for you to remember what those numbers were. Now, you may be doing different things to try and remember those numbers. Many people will say the numbers over and over to themselves in their head, using that little mental voice that we have. So they'll be saying 3, 1, 0, etc., etc. A few people might actually be seeing the words in a visual format, almost as if they have a mental screen in their heads, although that's much less common. Alan Baddeley, of course, refers to these processes in his working memory model. If you use the voice in your head, he calls that the phonological loop. If you use the mental screen in your head, that's the visuospatial sketch pad. So, can you remember what the numbers actually were? I'm not going to tell you what the numbers were right now. I'm going to come back to that in a little while in a slightly different context, as you will see shortly. So moving on then to the long-term storage of information. Can you think of a major public event which most people could recall? We're thinking here, of course, of what's called flashbulb memory, where major things that happen, lots of people are exposed to and will remember because they're such significant events. So the background you can now see is a very memorable event for people in the United Kingdom, which was the aftermath of the accidental death of Princess Diana, who was tragically killed in a road accident in Paris in the year 1997. So if you are old enough to remember that event, you may recall where you were when you first found out about that incident. And of course it provoked a huge national outpouring of grief. Those of you that remember it may remember that it was in 97. You might recall that it was in the summer. You might remember that it was in August. And in actual fact it was at the end of August. It was on the 31st. So the date would be 310819997, which were in fact the digits that you were asked to remember earlier. And now I've told you that context, you'd probably find them a lot easier to remember in future. Which illustrates how, when we remember information, it's useful to have a context within which to process it and make it less abstract. So now, can you think of a more personal memory, something that happened to you perhaps in your childhood? It's interesting to note that most of us do not remember very much at all from our childhood. Here's an example, a personal example for myself. This is the snail ride in Great Yarmouth. If you've ever been to Great Yarmouth, you may know it. And what you do is you sit inside these snails and they take you on a magical journey through an enchanted kingdom, which illustrates various childhood stories. And I remember going on this ride with my mother when I was on holiday in Great Yarmouth, round about 1971, when I was round about 6 or 7 years old. It's interesting to reflect on those particular memories that we do have from our childhood and what they might be telling us. What we're talking about here is the phenomena of autobiographical memory, which brings together both the personal narrative and episodic memories. These have often been described by theorists such as Martin Conway as self-defining memories. So self-defining memories are strong, clear, recallable. They're often linked to key goals and aims, and they often involve a strong emotional component. So I'm going to talk about the theory around this in a bit more detail in the next part. And so this is the end of part 1. If you want to follow on now, and we'll take up some of these issues again in part 2.